You know, we often joke that parenting doesn't come with a manual, but if it did, we'd need several different volumes because different kids require different parenting. And there is one kid category my next guest wants us to understand better. If you are the parent of a highly sensitive child, Studio 5 parenting contributor Heather Johnson says there is a direct correlation between your ability to parent them and how they fare in life. Welcome, Heather.
Thanks.
This is a big one, and we should clarify, we're talking about sensitivity as a character trait, not as a disorder.
Right, so we're looking at it as a personality trait, right? And we all have personality traits, every one of us. Maybe it's something about organization, or maybe we tend to be more intuitive, or maybe even just an introvert versus an extrovert. Maybe we're high sensitive. And our kids can be high sensitive. So there's a big difference in these two things. We're not going down a disorder path. Now, at the same time, you have to know that if there is a disorder to this, we can flush that out. We can figure that out too. But we're gonna look at those character traits. This is the child who, the way they process things is at a great depth. So for example, you're driving in the car and they say something to you like, why are we doing this? And you tell them and they go, I know, but why are we doing that? And you answer it and then they say, okay, but why are we doing those two things right now? And it just keeps going. There's a depth of understanding, right? There is overstimulation that comes with a high sensitive child. They're easily overstimulated, so they get flooded very quickly with emotions. You're looking at a high sensitive child when they're dealing with a lot of empathy. You might hear this from a child or teenager who's constantly telling you about a child in their class who's getting in trouble, or how they saw someone sad on the playground.
And they're internalizing
internalizing it. Now with empathy too, you're also looking for a child, if you're kind of trying to figure out if this applies to your children or your child. Empathy is a tricky one too, because sometimes they can be so flooded with the empathy that they shut it down. And so actually you might have a high sensitive child who, when you're dealing with them, they appear to have zero empathy for anyone.
Because it's too much.
Because it's so much that they've pushed it all away, and so they're not dealing with it at all. And so when we look at these character traits, we can see this is also overly stimulated when it comes to tags, or when their clothes aren't fitting right. Maybe
it's physically overstimulated.
Maybe it's something that they're tasting in a texture. It could be that simply they just don't like baggy clothes. Everything needs to be tight, or vice versa. Maybe they need everything really loose and they don't like their waistbands tight. All of this could lend itself to a highly sensitive child.
And before we jump forward too far, you mentioned, character trait to disorder. How might we tell if it's sliding toward a more diagnosable disorder?
Yeah, if it's gonna slide toward a disorder, you're gonna look at the frequency and the duration and also the intensity of their outbursts and what's going on.
Okay.
So if these outbursts are happening, if they're kind of melting down, and this is to teenagers too, we're not just talking little kids here, if they're melting down consistently, or 10 to 15 times a day, and it's happening week after week after week after week, you're gonna wanna start looking at something, right? We've moved from just our character traits. And also if it's happening in all sorts of places, instead of just sometimes, right? If it's a character trait, they usually can manage it. In some spaces it brings it out, and in others it doesn't. But if it's a disorder, it's probably happening everywhere. It's happening all the time.
Let's talk and help us, if you will, parent this sensitive child. And we know Heather's favorite accessory is the parenting mirror. Look in the mirror. But in this situation, applying to this topic, it really matters, you say, how we parent and how we behave. It
really, really matters. So we're gonna start with us always, right? One of my very favorite stories in history is about a doctor who delivered babies. His name was Dr. Semmelweis. And Dr. Semmelweis, when women would come to his floor to have their babies, 1 in 10 women died. The mortality rate on his floor was terrible, right? And so they were starting to have their babies actually on the sidewalk, because then the mortality rate went to 1 in 100 women who would pass away. And so he is working with these women, and he can't figure out what's going on. He can't figure out why they're passing away. He's doing everything that he can. He's treating all the symptoms. He's doing what he can. Well, he takes a break and he steps away from the hospital and comes back. And while he was gone, the mortality rate, it went down. Women were living. And so long story short, he comes to figure out that he was also working on cadavers while he was delivering these babies. And this is before germ theory. So we don't realize, he doesn't realize that he delivers a baby, works on a cadaver for research, which is great, comes back and works on that woman, and as a result, they're passing away. We now can watch any movie, and if you ever see a doctor movie, they're always scrubbing in, right? Yeah. That's a result of this doctor and us understanding germ theory. Now, the reason this matters and the reason it's my favorite is because it teaches us that as parents, if we're this doctor, he's quoted as saying he doesn't even or can't begin to count how many women struggled or suffered at his hands. And when we don't have ourselves together as parents, our children are in that same place. We don't realize the impact we're having on them when we don't understand that a lot of the problem does lie with us. It just does. And so instead of looking at this as a negative, we want to take a step back and go, okay, the way I parent might not best match up with my child's personality. It just might not.
That's powerful.
Just like Dr. Semmelweis and the way he was doing things, it didn't match up best with what he was trying to do with these women. So when we look at ourselves, some things we can start doing is we've got to manage our own emotions, especially when they're big. We've got to model this for our children. We've got to be very mindful that these personality traits, when our kids have the skills to manage empathy and being stimulated and sensitive and a depth of perception, when they have the tools to manage that, are those not characteristics that we want every single one of our children to have?
Those are amazing.
They are the most amazing characteristics. But if they don't have the tools, then they're not as amazing.
And you say in the beginning, it's not about their coping skills, it's about ours.
It's about us. We've got to make sure that our ability to parent does match up with who they are and what they're doing. And right along with that, we've got to manage our responses. You know, when our children have outbursts or when they break down, when they have struggles, and when they're highly sensitive, we tend to get impatient. And so we respond to things. For example, we've all had a child put on a pair of pants or a shirt and say, this bugs me, or I can't wear this. And if they're not careful, they kind of throw a fit a little bit. And we say, it's fine, just wear it for 5 minutes, you won't even notice.
You're fine.
Or we're out of time, let's go, we're gonna be late for school. And all of a sudden, our responses, they're contributing to that high sensitive character trait.
We're raising their
We are, and so we
emotion.
want to be really, really mindful of those things.
You want us to build self-concept.
Self-concept happens when our children develop who they are as a result of how we respond to them. And so we want to respond to them in ways that allows them to better understand who they are. We also want to make sure that we're not introducing shame when it comes to our kids. And so we want to get rid of that shame. When they're high sensitive, there is so much stimulation. This would be like a child who, you know, isn't wearing any protection between them and their emotions. And so everything is just flooding them in big, big, big ways. It's extra sensitive. And when we shame them and make them feel like something they've done is wrong as a result of feeling big, they feel shame.
So that's why are you crying? Or why are you so upset?
Why are you doing this? It's not that big of a deal. It shouldn't matter. I'm the parent. All of those type of responses.
So how do I discipline or how do I help teach proper behavior to a high sensitive child?
Well, we tend to think that it's consequences that are going to teach, that it's consequences that are going to help them. And it isn't actually consequences. Consequences aren't what are going to teach them. Us teaching them is what's going to teach them. So we need to teach them how to recognize those emotions, right? And if we're looking at our long-term goals here and what we want more than anything with our kids, we want them to be able to manage their own emotions. We have to teach them how to call them out, how to recognize them, and how to be okay with them. We also want long-term goals, and we then have to teach them next to be able to communicate their needs to us. We want them to be able to say, this feels this way to me, Mom, and then look and say, Mom, this is what I need right now as a result of all of these feelings that are flooding
So
me.
helping draw out those phrases as a parent is your consequence or is your teaching moment.
Is what we're trying to teach.
How often, Heather, or do I remove the child from the room? We talk about overstimulation, right? The noise or the sounds or the, you don't want them to feel like that's a punishment, right? They behave a certain way and they're instantly ripped out of the room.
Ideally, we want to teach them what to do when they have those things, which then takes us to a last goal that we have for our kids, which is how to creatively problem solve, right? Maybe they have to kind of store up some energy to go into an overstimulated situation. And so we teach them how to store up what they need so that they can go to that party or handle the day at school. We don't want to dismiss them from their lives. We want to teach them what to do when they feel so big about their lives. And so that's what we're trying to do. We want them to be able to manage it. We desperately want them to communicate, and we want them to be able to creatively problem solve any emotions that are too big or that feel giant to them. That's what we're trying to do.
Does this affect more children, more families than we realize?
15 to 20% of children are high sensitive, right? As a character trait. It's a pretty good number.
Yeah, that's
right?
a chunk.
And more than that, think about it. We've all been in high sensitive situations with our kids. I mean, when I say out loud, a child who doesn't want to wear an article of clothing because the tag or the seam or they're too tight.
That was me yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
Right? And we know high sensitive traits and situations. And so regardless of the numbers, we want to care about this because every child at some point in time, they'll be highly sensitive to something. They will.
And we'll be thinking of that illustrative example about the doctor and how we can better serve our patients, or in this case, our children. Thank you for pushing us to that place. For more information about Heather's counseling services, you can visit our website. Thanks again, Heather. Great job.